chainsaw history.
I don't even know how she can cope with that. It's like, how do you get shingles in your eye? And I was like, and you win.
Yeah.
That's one of the most horrific things I can think of outside of genitalia.
Shingles on the
Shingles
on
the
the
eye.
junk is even worse than the eye.
Anything on the junk seems to be the ultimate.
Well, speaking of shingles on the junk,
Ooh.
that has nothing to do with what we're going to talk about
Thank
today.
God.
Surprisingly, more diseases than you might expect. I'm Jamie Chambers. This is my sister, Bambi.
Hello.
This started because I fell down a rabbit hole of genealogy after I got an Ancestry.com DNA kit as a Christmas gift. This is not an endorsement. I'm not being paid to talk about them. It just is a thing that's true. But when I got the DNA results, then I started doing some family tree business, ended up subscribing to some paid services just so I can do the research. And then I started looking at history because I was going to be a college history professor once upon a time.
How did that work out?
I changed my major twice, minored in history, and then never did anything with it ever again.
So, college.
I'm really glad I'm facing crippling student
Yeah,
debt.
how's that student loan?
Not paid off yet. So who knows what this is actually going to be called, but I can tell you that's the main thing to know is I am not a historian. I only minored in history, but I am kind of a fan and nerd about history. And so like one of the things I think I'm good at is taking history, making it relatable to more people who aren't as into it as I am, telling it in terms that you can kind of get on board with and start to understand. And however, I'm probably, like, if we put this online, I'm probably going to classify it as comedy because I intend to swear a lot and reference drugs and unspeakable behavior.
No one can ever make me stop swearing. It's really terrible. Old people and small children just hate me.
Yeah, no, your little kids should not listen to this fucking podcast. So.
No. Little kids, I'm to the point where if you don't like swearing around your child, please don't bring your child around me. I'm just no longer give any fucks.
We will offend you. So maybe what we're going to be doing today is I'm going to be giving you a hopefully not incredibly boring nerdy history lecture, but it's going to be related to something in our family tree. So we're going to start there with a family connection, and luckily this is going back many generations, so we can't humiliate anyone currently alive.
Which is, it's good and also sort of.
And this is actually, like, this story is one of the things that gave me the idea of doing this show, at least the thing we're going to intro with. And then it's going to lead us into a larger historical topic that I don't think enough Americans talk enough about, or know enough about, really. So, you ready to do this thing?
I was about to say, that could literally be anything.
So what would be...
That's so vague, it could be anything.
What would be your fictional time travel machine that we need to use to jump back to 18th century colonial America? So, well, this is going to be full historical, but I was just thinking, like, do we want to take, like, H.G. Wells' time machine or the TARDIS? Or
no. I need Mr. Peabody's Wayback Machine.
Oh, okay, excellent.
That's where I am. If we're getting in a time machine, I'm getting in with the dog.
Excellent. So we're going...
That's the driver, because
so
apparently I'm fucked up
we're going to
like
jack Mr. Peabody's machine. And we're going to take it back first to the year 1756 before we jump back a few extra years before that.
Okay.
So it was Saturday, February 10th, 1756. A 12-year-old boy named David Boyd was sent by his mother to gather dry firewood while the father of the family was visiting their nearest neighbor, who was over a mile away. This was central Pennsylvania in the mid-1700s when these were like settler families that did not have a lot of neighbors. They were just trying to carve out...
They didn't have a lot of
farmland.
anything.
Yeah.
Period.
So these settlers were strict Presbyterians, and it was kind of their habit to get all the important work done by the end of the day because Sundays meant to be purely rest and worship. Grabbing his hatchet, young David took his little brother, John Jr., who was 6 years old, along to gather the firewood. That's when a band of Native Americans from the Delaware tribe, according to the sources, surprised the boys and took them captive without much struggle.
Okay.
John Boyd Sr., the father, was missed walking through the woods, but the rest of the family was gathered together. The mother, Nancy, was not in great health, and it could be that she just hadn't recovered yet from childbirth.
Well, yeah, because she probably had several of those.
She had there's like 7 or 8 of these Boyd kids.
Oh, okay. Because, women, you either gave birth to children or you died in childbirth.
She was constantly pregnant.
constantly, because I mean that was you're either pregnant or you were dead.
Yeah, and so far she had good luck when it came to delivering all these kids. Unfortunately, her luck runs out today. This is not a great day for Nancy. All we know is that she wasn't in great health, so it could be that she was still recovering from childbirth because she's carrying her infant James Thomas, but she can't keep up because these are fast-moving native raiders. Yeah. And a bunch of like frontier settler children who are all in great shape. So,
well, yeah, I mean, after your entire fucking reproductive system gets turned into mincemeat, yeah.
For the, like, 7th time.
For, like, the 7th time. Yeah, in colonial times when there was no such thing as modern medicine, and she was probably just, like, leaky and bleedy and terrible. Really poor Nancy.
Yeah, and unfortunately things are not going to get any better for Nancy at this point. Because
I hope Nancy dies swiftly.
So that's horrible. This is pretty fucking grim, but here we go. She's got her infant son James Thomas, and the natives realize this woman can't keep up. They're taking prisoners, but she can't keep up with them, and they're on foot. So she sits. The natives sat Nancy down with her baby on a fallen tree and let her say goodbye to her children one at a time. David, he quoted her later in life saying, "Oh God, be merciful to my children going among savages." She was only 37 years old. Once the captive children were out of sight, the warriors left behind killed both the mother and the child and scalped them both.
Yeah, sounds about right.
David and his sister Sally were forced to later take turns carrying the scalps of their murdered mother and baby brother for an entire day. Aww. And that only one example of the humiliation and cruelty they'd be forced to endure. Which started...
Yeah, cradling your mother's head.
Yes, the top of your mom's head and your little baby brother.
Oh, that's fucking brutal.
We don't know exactly how old the kid was, but it was less than a year. That's kind of what we know. So he's either a small toddler or a true infant. We don't know. Either way, that's pretty fucking rough. And then they had to watch as their home, their family farmhouse was looted and burned before they all had to run off taking turns carrying mom's scalp.
That also sounds about right.
Welcome to the mid-1700s.
Yeah, it was a fucking terrible place.
John Boyd Sr., the distraught father of this family, was forced to watch his home burn from a distance before setting off to alarm local settlers and organize a pursuit. He took one look at this situation and was like, I could rush down there and die.
Yeah, I mean, dying doesn't seem like a very intelligent option, although, when he finds his wife and baby's, head eventually, hopefully, then that's also fucking terrible. Okay.
Yeah, there's not great either way. So, but he did what made the most sense. He went to organize people, but because like their nearest neighbor was the one he was just at a mile away. By the way, those two people were killed in this raid as well. They were childless. That family completely wiped off the map, and their home also burned. So, because the pioneers were scarce in central Pennsylvania, it took some time to gather the needed men, guns, and supplies, which was more than enough time for the swift Delaware raiding party and the white pioneer children to make a lot of distance. When the pursuit party led by John Boyd Sr., they found shreds of Nancy's dress clinging to some bushes off a trail, and then they followed tracks to a nearby ravine.
Oh, that's horrible.
And looking down in the ravine, they see the scalped and mutilated bodies of Nancy and baby James.
The headless corpses.
Well, not decapitated, just just scalped. So by the time
the world was terrible.
Yeah, by the time David and his surviving siblings reached the native villages in what's now Ohio, John Sr. had given up hope of ever seeing his children alive again. Now, we'll get back to David in a different conversation, but I bring his story up first because the earliest sources are all about how cruel and the savagery of the native people, but they always just talk about it just purely in that context and never in the larger story about what else is going on. So that's what I'm going to do today. Okay. These brutal raids were part of a larger conflict that American history books call the French and Indian War. So, like, as a, pulling from high school history, do you remember anything at all about the French and Indian War?
No, not a thing. Okay. I mean, I could guess that it would be between both French people and Native Americans.
And that's about as much as anybody does, because the truth is, our public education in the United States tends to gloss over this because the Revolutionary War is only a couple decades away, and that's what excites everybody because we're in terms of indoctrinating.
Well, that and
people.
we're not French.
Indeed. Without this war and without our colonial ancestors' victory in that war, there would almost certainly be no United States of America as we know it. It's a really fascinating struggle in its own right, while setting all the initial pieces on the chessboard for what will eventually be America's war for independence. But it's also important to remember the French and Indian War is just one theater in a larger conflict between European colonial powers that spanned 5 continents. Winston Churchill called it the true First World War, beating the one we call World War I by 150 years.
Because we didn't care about those people. I mean,
in fact, that's exactly right.
Nobody gave a fuck.
The indigenous populations in all of these places get caught in the middle and screwed
and
over.
completely fucked.
Because these relatively small European nations were projecting power all over the globe.
Yeah, I mean, it's like, the Native American people were very brutal and very savage and very, very, very pissed off at this point. And who could blame them?
This is when colonialism started really getting going, you know. So the global war is called the 7 Years' War, which lasted either 7 years or 9 years or maybe even 22, depending on which historian you ask and which skirmish.
Well, if it's the 22-year war, I feel like the 7-year war is a really misnomer.
There's a lot of that in history, but the fact is, at the same time, is like the French and Indian War.
That's a big discrepancy. I mean, 7 and 9, sure. 7 and 22, that's pretty fucked, y'all.
You know, it's all just about deciding at which point is like the starting bell, you know, which things officially kicked it off. Because especially for the global war, there was a lot of stuff related to like royal succession and like little territorial disputes. So there's an argument to be made of where it really started. However, a lot of people will say it gets started in the colonies, and that's what we're going to get into. I also started with David Boyd's story for one more reason. He is our 5th great-grandfather. So that guy's family entirely kidnapped by...
The Boyds, yes.
Yeah, that was our maternal grandmother's family. So if you go to our grandmother's father's father and going up to what's our 5th great-grandfather, that was David Boyd, who at 12 years old was kidnapped by Delaware natives. And we will get back to him later. We're gonna do a whole separate... mini episode just in his life, because I assumed all of our ancestors would have boring as shit lives.
And then you found out about the horrific kidnapping, scalping,
that turns into kind of a real life Dances with Wolves kind of story. It's really it's interesting and complicated, because it's like, on one hand, when you know the whole larger story, you can understand why the natives did their raids. You can also understand why it sucks when your mom gets scalped and you get captured and tortured,
forced to carry around her.
But then later on, like we'll talk about it later. But David goes full native and actually comes to love the chief of that tribe, who was there when his family was captured and his home burned, but came to see that man as his true father. It's an interesting story, but we'll get back to him.
So, Stockholm Syndrome.
But we'll get back to David Boyd at another time, because at this point, we're going to get into the larger history. That's the why all that shit just happened to him and his family.
The French and Indian War.
So I'm not going to get into the whole 7 years World War thing. I'd rather focus on the slice of it that concerns our country and our ancestors, because we don't have like 7 hours to talk about this. The international business is like an entire history course all by itself. But ironically, it's kind of worth noting that there was a point where British soldiers were fighting the French and Indians from India on the subcontinent, while we had our own French and Indian War going on over here.
So there was too many Indians. We didn't.
And we're bad at naming things.
We're really bad at naming things, misnomers.
Yeah. So we had literally that level of confusion going on at that point. So let's set the stage for our conflict. England and France had beef for basically ever at this point in the 18th century, always looking for an excuse to get back for the previous scuffle that they'd had.
Well, I mean, that's pretty much half the wars throughout history.
Oh, yeah.
Just, well, I mean...
Revenge or get territory you lost back.
Most wars are just pissing contests between men. Over
basically
land,
white rich men are trying to fight over more stuff,
back and forth.
So England, France, constantly going at it, and meanwhile, this was like I said, this is when the colonialism is really getting going. So
because white men didn't want to pay taxes,
going all over the fucking place.
Rich white men didn't want to pay their fair share of taxes.
Well, that gets into our American Revolution, of course. Like, you're going to see so much of like seeds of what makes Americans all the way back before there was such a thing. The British colonies were all on the eastern coastline of the United States. And then the French were holding the territory to the north and west of the Appalachian Mountains. So up into Canada and then spilling down into the mainland from there.
Okay.
but over more on the western side.
So some cold motherfucking land.
And similarly to now, there's a population difference. So like for, the British population vastly outnumbered the French Canadians. But at the same time, France had vast more territory. Kind of like how Canada is huge, but has 1/10 of the population of the United States.
Because it's fucking cold there.
But that was the situation they were in. Now, you always got to remember the purpose of a colony is to generate profit for the mother country through the mercantile economic model.
Everything is about profit.
Oh, always.
Always.
Now, and that's another thing, like, what they tell you back in school and the sort of oversimplified version of the mercantile system is that, raw goods are gathered from the colony, shipped back over to the mother country where they're turned into finished manufactured products, and then sold, some of them sold back to the original places they came from, with all of the markups that come with overseas shipping twice, and everybody getting their cut along the way. But now the British colonies, for well over 100 years, had enjoyed what's called salutary neglect. Now, neglect doesn't sound good, but salutary is literally the same root word as salute. It literally is like a term of respect. Basically saying, hey, the colonies are running themselves and getting themselves established, so we're not going to enforce all of these taxes. We're not going to enforce the trade's exclusivity that you would normally have. So technically,
they were left alone.
Yeah, there was technically a lot of smuggling going on that they just didn't bother to enforce, and there were taxes that they were on the books, but they never once tried to collect. Things like that. So for a long time, the American colonists got used to being left the fuck alone. So like the merchant class in England was super influential at the time. So they were making a lot of money. They're all the rich, rich business owners. They're making money. So everything's going well. So there's not a lot of reason for England to rock the boat by enforcing all these rules. So they were letting a lot go, and the colonists were used to doing things their own way. Meanwhile, the native peoples had endured, the encroachment of and displacement by all these European settlers for hundreds of years. So by the time we get to the mid 1700s, there were already just tons of treaties, alliances, and trade agreements in place. So
most of which weren't upheld.
Yeah, well, they were, after some time, it was very Darth Vader of them. We have altered the deal. Pray we do not alter it further, even though we're going to, over and over again. And fuck you over, until the end of time.
Still try.
So, but here there was some differences. So the French had all this land, but not as many people. So they were much more reliant on the natives. So they worked really hard to have agreements that they actually held up their end of the bargain more, and they intermarried a lot. So like the French tended to drop their racial prejudices and enter into these highly profitable marriage
They
arrangements.
sell their daughters into marriage.
Like,
that's pretty par for the course.
The chief, marries off his daughter to this French Canadian business. And meanwhile, so his tribe can suddenly help with their fur, because the French Canadians were doing, their main source was the fur trade. So there's tons of trapping of animals in which the natives were really good at helping with all that. So everybody's making some cash. And so the French, dudes were like, I will marry your daughter. I am highly in love with all of the money we are about to make.
Because, whatever. It's not like wives aren't disposable anyway.
Beaver pelts work for good money. So,
beaver pelts.
Yeah.
It's like you just traded your daughter for a beaver pelt. That's
No, for all of the
that's
cash
a beaver pelt for a beaver pelt.
The cash, guns, and booze you get for selling your daughter to get beaver pelts to white people on the other side of the world. But that was just like so the French had much stronger native alliances than the British, who would make a treaty and then violate it whenever it was convenient for them. Even though it's not to defend the French, it's just there were less of them, so they were kind of forced into this situation. So both sides start far apart on the map, but colonizers be colonizing, and as both sides are expanding their territory, it was like a pressure cooker. Eventually it was gonna explode. Both France and England were claiming areas such as Nova Scotia and Acadia in the north. And Acadia, as a side note, is, as a result of all the shit that we're about to talk about, the Acadian people were forced out and told to march south into what's now Louisiana, and that's where Cajun people come from. But at first, we're just talking about settlers in small numbers. So like our great-great-great-grandfather we were talking about earlier and his family, so they would, move over to the other side of the Appalachian Mountains because it was just amazing farmland, in Ohio. I mean, always has been, always will be, probably.
You can grow some shit there.
Yeah.
Mostly corn.
Lots and lots of corn. And it was kind of a ballsy thing to be an English settler in the Ohio River Valley because it was claimed by France. There was a disputed territory. And it was also home to all these native tribes who were allied and intermarried as fuck with all of the French people. So to the natives, raiding and burning these homesteads was both getting rid of more white people and doing a solid for their French allies. But on the British side, they had their own treaty negotiated by a Native American leader named Tenagrisson. And I probably completely butchered that guy's name. So I'll just use the kind of cool nickname that the white people gave him, the Half King.
The Half King.
The Half King. There was, in colonial history, there was a few people they nicknamed the Half King, and it's basically the racist version of respect because this guy was the chief of the Mingo people who were, it's kind of like a blend of other tribes that were displaced or half wiped out. And he was he was a leader among them. So a not white guy can't be a king. So he's a half king.
Half king.
So yes, this is racism, even in his nickname, but still, half king still half a cool nicknames. Yeah. So he's going to come back into this story a couple of times, but for now, just know that the half king had come to an agreement on behalf of like a whole tribal council representing a number of different, groups of Native Americans, including the Iroquois Confederacy.
I was about to say, I wondered if the Iroquois League was going to...
Oh, yeah. The Iroquois are all a part of this. In fact, at the moment, he's been given kind of the blessing to speak on their behalf, even though sometimes they got their own people in there. And once again, I'm kind of having to super simplify some of this stuff because we're doing a short podcast and not like a 400 level American history class. So it's already kind of warm in our pressure cooker when the colonial powers turn up the knob by building military forts to project power directly into the wilderness. There had been previous scuffles, there had been some treaties and more tension building, and then the old Governor General of New France died, and his eventual replacement was a guy named the Marquis Duquesne. At this point, French started getting a little bit more picky about enforcing their treaties with their own tribal allies. Like, for example, the Miami people are not supposed to trade with the British. They have an exclusive deal with the French. And so the French tell the Miami people to knock it off. The Miami people ignore them.
Yeah, because fuck you.
And so the French decide to call up some of their own Ottawa tribal allies and send in some troops with muskets to straighten the Miami people out. Because, once again, as cozy as the French were with the natives, it only goes so far. If you still fuck with the money, you gonna get shot.
Well, yeah, because, again, it's really the bottom line.
Don't fuck with white people's money.
Do not fuck with people's money. It's our hard line.
But in this case, they were simply just trading with everybody and not just the French. And then they got shot. So by the time we get into 1753, it becomes clear that in order to protect this really important region that everybody knows is going to be covered with the best farms in colonial America, the French will need to keep armed men in the region at all times. So up goes some forts. And you can probably imagine what these 18th century wilderness forts look like. They're completely made out of wood from local timber. There'll be a few central buildings surrounded by a palisade, which is like sharpened tree trunks in a fence all the way around. So, but yeah, the forts were not the coziest of accommodations, but were a hell of a lot better than being camped in the middle of a forest filled with Native Americans who are really good at
killing
around in that said forest. The French expanded south, and they were kicking out any British squatters along the way. And then that caused more heated conversations to go back in the colonial capitals about what's going on. More and more French are moving into the area. And then the native allies that were the natives of the British were saying, what the fuck? And the Half King, he absolutely hated the French. The guy told stories to anyone who would listen that the French had killed, cooked, and eaten his father.
Ooh.
I mean, and if that's true, legit reason to hate the French.
Yeah. Even if you even just think that's true, it's a legit reason to hate the French. So fuck those frog-eating, human-eating motherfuckers.
I have no full information.
Once you get they ate my dad, you can see some not nice things.
So the Half King actually marches up.
I also think Scalp Mom is on that list too.
Also pretty rough.
Yeah.
So the Half King marches right up to the gates of Fort Le Boeuf, and yes, like Shia LaBeouf, translates literally the beef.
Oh.
So he goes into Fort Le Boeuf and just yells at them that the French need to leave this area or he threatens military action. And you can imagine, the French on the other side, going all Monty Python.
Oh my, ha ha ha, your mother smells of elderberries.
Go away or I will taunt you a second time. So the half king goes off in a huff, having accomplished, fuck all. But he's
other than being horribly mocked.
He was rebuffed at LeBouf. So runners were dispatched to the important British colonial leaders to let them know about the French troop presence in the Ohio River Valley. And not only did the British have their own claims to protect, but there were important business contracts writing it. Because once again, there's always money. History books often don't like to talk about all the money involved.
Oh, well, that's the thing. I mean, money is at the root of all of it.
All evil.
I mean,
and we're about to get into some evil.
All of it.
So the half king sent his people. The chief of the Mohawk showed up on behalf of their tribal council, representing a whole nother group of Native Americans who were all allied with the British, and demanded that the British live up to their obligations to keep the French out of the area. And when the governor of New York didn't immediately just call up troops and to get this shit started, they took off pissed off. And that was the point where they say that the cozy relationship between the British and the Iroquois Confederacy took a hit. It wasn't completely broken down at this point, but
I was about to say, because that came later.
Yeah, so the French have really strong alliances with their native allies, and the British just weakened their ones with the most important. Because in this area, the Iroquois are the ones you need the most. Now, the Cherokee, they're kind of in the background of the story, and through the course of the war, they switch sides 4 times. They're just whichever is the most expedient.
Whichever way the wind blows.
Yeah, no, they're all of them were just trying to do the best they could in a shitty situation as they were slowly losing land and having to overlook more atrocities.
Since we live on Cherokee land.
We're recording this from occupied Cherokee land. So believe it or not, that was all just the prelude to our real story.
Yep.
It's time to introduce our main character for the rest of this talk today. There are plenty of important figures we could have picked and some different angles we could have looked at, but as Americans, and especially thinking of this from a quote unquote family point of view, there's only one choice: the father figure of us all. I speak, of course, of George motherfucking Washington.
He's a complicated dude.
Yeah.
He's all kinds of full of good things and bad things. Rolled into one and extraordinarily complicated human man.
But this is young George Washington.
Oh, so was he less complicated and more of a dick?
I'm going to be interested to see where you are at the beginning of this, and then once we get to the end of the second part, or actually all of it, just how your opinion will shift. But just think back for a moment and think of yourself just like in grade school. We all think of George Washington in the Revolutionary War and as first president of the United States.
Some kid that chopped down a cherry tree, which turns out was complete and total utter bullshit and didn't even really have any kind of relevance in life, and yet we still learn that.
Yeah, I'm pretty sure that even halfway through high school, I was convinced George Washington had a homicidal hatred of cherry trees and a psychotic inability to lie.
And then you were like, no, that motherfucker lied all the time.
None of those things were true. It turns out cherry trees were perfectly safe around him, and he lied his ass off when necessary. However, while being, a relatively forthright dude, but as we're about to see. So this is not the white-haired figure in the Hall of Presidents at Disneyland. In 1752, little Georgie was only 20 years old, the age of your nephew. So you got to think about Xander in your head in terms of that's how old this guy is when this story starts.
20-year-old
punk-ass
kid.
This kid, even though, of course, in the 1700s, even children are just considered little adults expected to just do what they're needed to be done. But he was very ambitious, but he had no idea the incredible place he would take in the world and all of history. But let's get a visual picture of young George Washington at this point. He's 6 feet tall, which is, in mid-1700s is pretty big guy.
So he's little shorter than Xander.
Right, but if you grade him on a curve, he would be more like 6'3" or 4.
Yeah, because people were
average
back
guys
then.
were more like 5'3" to 5'4" back then. So he was a pretty big guy, and in fact, he was strong as hell, and his hands were so big he had to have custom-made gloves for the size of his just oven mitt,
his big meat hands,
tennis racket size hands. So he's got reddish brown hair that's tied back in a tight tail or sometimes fitted in a silk bag. And though we're a long way from his denture years, even at 20 years old, George had Austin Powers teeth.
Dentistry is important, children.
He had terrible tooth decay, and so even at this age, it was bad enough that a friend from this time in his life wrote a letter about how fucked up his teeth were. And so he even as a young man, he had this very tight-lipped expression that you see in all of the paintings and statues, because his whole life he was super self-conscious about his teeth. Interestingly enough, though, he did not have like the booming, commanding voice you would expect from a George Washington. Though he was physically strong, George kept getting sick, because this, of course, the era of just all kinds of disease. Of
pestilence.
Because it's like, on one hand, it's like before any real like actual medicine, but it's also when world travel was a thing and diseases were truly traveling the globe at speeds never dreamt before this time. Like, it literally took years for the Black Death to move from China all the way to like Western Europe, but now shit can just move in a matter of months because of all these ships going all over the world. Thank you, imperialism. So
well,
George,
I can't. I like traveling, so
yeah, no, travel's good.
Travel's
just
good.
so
I mean, not traveling on a boat for months.
So are vaccines.
Getting lied to about how awesome this place is. That's.
So, again, despite being physically strong, George kept getting sick. By the time he was 20, he'd already had malaria, smallpox, and a nasty bout of pleurisy in his lungs, which left him with kind of a weak, breathy voice that didn't seem to match his, superimposing things. So I guess he talked kind of like original Dumbledore from Harry Potter, with kind of a wheezy voice. I'm George Washington.
That would be amazing.
So think about that for the rest of this story. Just this kind of like kick-ass looking guy.
I cannot think it's Dumbledore. George Washington just got really fucked up in my head, especially now. And then make him 20
years old, wheezy George.
Wheezy George.
And unfortunately, all later in life, it's pneumonia that he caught that killed him. So his lungs got him in the end.
As they do.
Yeah. So young George was an interesting guy, kind of a study in contradictions. His temper was absolutely terrifying. So he worked at keeping a tight lid on his emotions. He developed self-control, because if he lost his shit, it was bad. And he was a big, strong dude with massive hands.
Well, I mean, self-awareness.
He was a bit of a romantic, but especially when he was writing love letters to his various young lady friends. But he was always deadly serious, and he was for a young man, he was not the life of the party. He was the guy who would be, even when everybody else is trying to relax and have a drink, he'd be the guy talking about politics and current affairs, even when you're just
trying to have a good time, dude.
I'm staying off social media, asshole.
I already told you, I'm in my media bubble.
Yeah. So George wanted very much to be part of Virginia high society, but he didn't have the money or the family name back from England to carry him. Kind of a fancy boy. He loved fashionable clothes and enjoyed dancing. He learned the latest courtly dances. So if you imagine young, wheezy George Washington doing Jane Austen style, dancing. It was fine. It was just that you don't really, when you think of George Washington, you don't think of him really working hard to be this fancy boy. He ordered his clothes from London every
fop,
year.
If you will.
Yeah. No, he ordered his clothes from London every year. So he was this fancy boy, but the flip side, because it's always about these contradictions, he was a natural outdoorsman who adapted easily to life in the rough country. I mean, he was a brave and badass guy. But what he wanted, though, was to be part of this, high-end society. He wanted to be an important person.
Well, I would say then he accomplished his goal.
So, and here's the another ironic thing. So once he did set his sights on military service, what he wanted more than anything else was a royal commission in the proper British Army. Because in the colonies, there was no standing army. They just called up militias when they needed them, which were, only got paid for the time they did work. And it was a lot less, and there was a lot less prestige. And so it was sort of
and you had to abandon your farm and your bullshit
do all this stuff
at a moment's notice.
Whereas if you actually get a commission in the British Army, that is a full-time gig that comes with a lot of prestige and honor and can lead to the kind of political career that George is already looking for. So what he wants to do is fight for the British more than anything else. But through his whole life,
fight for the British. Well, isn't that
ironic? He wants to
ironic?
be a redcoat, but he never manages to achieve this. However, to be fair, he also goes on to defeat that very army and become president of a whole new country. So I think he wins.
I would say so. I mean, considering, he's the father of our country, not just some nameless faceless British soldier that's long dead.
And it will make anybody who's been a fuck up feel better when you hear this story, because it's not just all in one straight direction upward for George. He has some setbacks. But it starts though, and I think this helps you understand too. I'm going to reference Alexander Hamilton and even the musical Hamilton a few times. But if you learn about young George Washington, and then you know a bit about young Alexander Hamilton later on, you really get the sense of why George Washington saw a lot of himself in Hamilton. Because they were both men who had something to prove. Like Alexander Hamilton was the son of a Scottish nobleman, but he was a bastard.
In theory.
In theory. That's a
theory.
whole nother story. But in theory, he had that name, but he was desperately poor, and he always was trying to prove himself. He was always trying, and Hamilton tried to fit in with fancy society and dressed himself up and all that shit. As I said, George, there was a lot in common with these two guys, even though George was not a bastard. He was, however, the oldest son in a second marriage. So it's like there was an original batch of Washingtons, and then the mom died, and then several years later, his dad, Gus, married another woman, and then George was the oldest of the second batch kids. So
that could go either way depending on how his father how he liked his wives or children.
Right. And it's kind of this thing basically was...
Because no one was really protected.
They were a landowning family. The Washingtons had held land in Virginia going generations back, even before Augustine, which is, Gus was his nickname. Gus Washington's family history. But at the same time, like, this older batch of children got all of the best stuff. They inherited the early property and cash and got all this extra stuff. They all got to go to paid primary school and college. George Washington had no formal schooling his entire life. So, and you could always tell that was sort of not only jealousy, but kind of like a shortcoming. And he always felt the absence of that. Because, like, his brothers learned how to speak French and could read Latin and got all this advanced stuff. And
probably learned all those fancy dances in college.
Yeah. George is having to, go and learn all this stuff himself. But George, so he was, kind of equivalently, basically homeschooled, and he did learn, certainly could read, write, and do math and solid stuff. He just didn't have the classical education that you get back then. The
formal education that you would get. So his mother had to have made up
and actually,
his education. And apparently, he seems like he was a pretty educated dude. So.
And not just his mother. His mother was actually a bit crude and half illiterate. So George was... I don't mention her much, but George had a complicated relationship with his mother.
Don't we all?
Yeah, I know, right? That's a whole nother interesting story. He had some mommy issues for sure, and she kept fucking with his life at different points.
So he had mommy issues and some daddy issues?
Daddy issues. However, his daddy issues were cut short because his dad died before he was 12 years old. So it's like, on one hand, he was well off by the standards of the time. By the standards of the time and actual working class poor people, he was well off. But in terms of the Virginia high society that he aspired to be, he was
far short.
He was down. He felt like he was a loser. But he was very good at math. And it came in really handy because by the time he was 17 years old, he got himself a gig as an apprentice for a land surveyor. And then eventually completed that and went on. By the time he was 19 years old, he had a career going surveying.
Okay.
So he would run off into the country, taking measurements and, making meticulous notes for all these rich people to come and occupy this land. And to the point where he not only had plenty of his own freelance work, but he got named the county surveyor of one of the counties in Virginia. So he had
okay, yeah, because that was surveying was a huge... When
colonizing was
literally
going on.
No maps.
Yeah, and so they had to do it, and these are people who are wanting to establish farms and build buildings, and you have to have a skilled surveyor so you can make all your plans and know where you're going to build your shit. And George was reputedly very good at it, and in fact, he could have just done that and been successful, and then have been the end, and probably maybe no America.
Well, that would have been a shorter story.
Yeah, for sure. The end. Roll credits. More than anyone else, George looked up to his older brother Lawrence. The oldest living Washington, he was a soldier and businessman, landowner and politician. That sound familiar?
Oh, okay.
But Lawrence came down with tuberculosis, I think in his early to mid 40s, if I remember correctly. And he was not doing so great. Having TB in the mid 1700s sucks.
I mean, having TB now sucks.
Oh, it sucks, period. But in this case, when your doctor says you're probably going to die, but that maybe if you go move to Barbados, the tropical climate might help you restore you.
I mean, it won't hurt I would rather move to Barbados. Although I guess in that point too, it's like, well, unless you get malaria, because having TB and malaria would be terrible.
But the good news is they'd already had everybody in Virginia had malaria by that point.
Oh well, there you go then.
So George dropped everything and accompanied his brother to Barbados. That was George's one and only time out of the continental, Americas, and he got a little taste of that kind of island life and saw a little bit more of the greater world. But guess what? Spoiler alert, it didn't work, and Lawrence returned to Virginia to die at his home in Mount Vernon.
Where this seems to...
Yeah, so he named his younger brother George as the heir to his estate in the event his own children didn't survive. You can probably guess how that turned out.
So I guess they didn't survive.
Yeah, unfortunately, poor Lawrence had 4 children. All of them died before the age of 5 years old, most of them as babies.
Which was common.
And unfortunately, his little girl who survived him only lasted to like 4.5, and then she got sick of some childhood illness. Like, unfortunately, it's like one of those things. One of the most common misconceptions is this idea that the average age people died was in their 40s or early 50s or whatever. But what they don't understand is almost everybody died before they were 5 years old. And so, like, babies dying or a childhood illness wiping a kid out at like 3 years old, that was super common. Or just accidents, which is dangerous to be a kid back then. But if you made it to a teenager, you were probably going to have a normal life expectancy, even by our standards. You're probably going to live to your 60s to maybe even 80s if you're really lucky. So it's just math that makes it where that average age, and that's like a major misconception.
Children die,
and unfortunately,
I mean, it's like you have 8 children and you have 2 surviving children. That was pretty common.
Fucks up the math, and that's why you also have all those kids.
Fucks up your vagina.
But so then this poor woman, she had 4 children by Lawrence Washington. None of them survived. Like, imagine having to bury 4 kids, and then he dies, and then she goes and remarries. So that instantly means Mount Vernon goes to George. And interestingly enough, total side note, but Mount Vernon was named for a British admiral named Edward Vernon, who was Lawrence Washington's commanding officer when he'd been in the British military. So the most super famous American historical sites named after a British admiral.
Well, nothing's perfect.
So 1752, Washington's hit this point where he wants to own property, not just be a surveyor for a bunch of other people. And you really get the sense that he wants to follow his dead brother's lead and kind of like achieve the things that Lawrence could have if he had lived long enough.
Like political clout,
right?
And
yeah.
Now that he can he can have the social standing that he wants.
Yeah, Lawrence Washington, he'd held a position on the House of Burgesses, which was like a high-ranking, it was a sort of a legislature type position.
Okay.
And Washington wanted to have a similar thing. So he had political goals. He wanted to own money. He wanted to have business deals. He wanted to wear fancy shoes. And
dance.
That all of the above. And marrying well. So we're saying, George is trying to live up to what Lawrence might have done if he'd have survived. But tuberculosis took out Lawrence. So that meant the thing missing on George's resume next was military service. And this is just as our pressure cooker in North America is heating up. So one of the things that's not brought up much, like I said earlier, is how much money and business interests factor into the lead up to the French and Indian War. The British government had awarded a huge land grant to the Ohio Company. This collection of these land speculators, and if the French held on to all this land in the Ohio River Valley, they stand to lose a fortune.
Okay.
The Ohio Company made a recommendation to build a fort at the forks of the Ohio River. So it's like the perfect spot where the rivers branch off to establish control of the area.
The fort forks.
The fort at the forks. And so, right here would be a perfect spot. Have a fort with a bunch of troops stationed. That way they can protect settlers. And, you always have people in the area to establish control. One of the major investors in the Ohio Company was none other than Lawrence Washington. So, who died this same year when this is going on. But he had been part of this, he drafted this recommendation. We should build a fort here. Please, Virginia government, do that. So when the Governor General Duquesne of New France learned of the British proposed forts, he's like, well, we got our own forts. We will build our own forts from Lake Erie all the way down to the Ohio River. And probably had both middle fingers raised while he was doing it. So the British announced that they want to build forts, and he's like, well, we're going to build our own forts, directly opposing your forts.
So they can taunt each other from across the river.
So once again, the temperature's going up. We're not there at war yet.
So now it's just like the insults and the antics ensue.
Right. So on the British side, the awesomely named Robert Dinwiddie was Lieutenant Governor of Georgia.
Dinwiddie.
Dinwiddie. He is a major player in this story.
Not Dimwitty, but
Nope.
Dinwiddie.
It is a very like J.K. Rowling kind of name. So he is the Lieutenant Governor of Virginia, also a major investor in the Ohio Company, along with Lawrence Washington. But as the Lieutenant Governor, he was also in a position to do something about it. He petitioned the British Crown for permission to build the proposed forts in the contested land. Took an entire year, but orders came back from London. Build the forts and send an envoy to inform the French that their presence in the Ohio River Valley was no longer welcome. George saw his opportunity and went for it, requesting the appointment as the envoy.
I'm going to guess that didn't go well.
Well, that's what we're about to talk about. Now, you might wonder why the hell anyone would appoint a 21-year-old kid with zero military experience in charge of an important expedition that, like, with diplomatic implications across the globe.
Yeah.
But then you remember that George was known because he was working so hard to fit in with all these folks and was out there surveying all this land. So they knew he had experience going out into the woods and dealing with shit. And you also remember George's older brother was a major investor in this company. That's the whole reason we're doing this. And then...
So now he's a major shareholder.
So you can probably guess that the Governor Dinwiddie felt better that somebody with the company's interests in mind was the guy leading this expedition. And in fact... George, through the rest of his life, was accused of representing the company, the Ohio Company, not necessarily the British government and the Virginian colonists.
That tracks.
It's hard to really say. However,
that sounds like a track.
But once you see how this all goes, it's like I said, George is a complicated guy. You'll have to tell me how you feel about him after the end of all this shit. So, according...
Oh, Lord, I don't know how I feel about him now. I doubt any more information is going to help that.
The orders were simple enough. Ron Chernow writes in his biography of Washington, quote, "If the French were found to be building forts on English soil, they should be peacefully asked to depart. If they failed to comply, however, we do strictly charge and command you to drive them off by force of arms." This order was signed by none other than King George II, the father of our King George.
Yeah, I was about to say, so
this
not
is daddy
the third.
of our King George from our story of the American Revolution.
Because all King Georges,
So at this point, George Washington is acting under direct orders from King George himself. So the newly minted Major George Washington, and yes, that's right, he goes from never having served any military experience to now he's a major in charge of this expedition.
By means of money.
Yeah. Wasted no time in recruiting his team. Even though, however, to be fair, one of the things he does, he is not given any upfront cash. He has to fund all this shit himself and get paid on the back end. But that's what you do because he's wanting to fit in with all these rich folk, and that's how this is done.
Well, I mean, that's a lot of that tracks as well. I mean, especially
if you're a gentleman,
the history of America.
Yeah, if you're a gentleman and you're going to serve your country, you're expected to fund it, and then you come back and then we'll pay you.
And hope that they actually live up to that agreement because
the
U.S. Congress doesn't like to do that either.
Yep, we're going to get to that because that's
they
a thing.
Sucked from before inception.
Yeah, but they weren't even a thing and they fucked this up.
Somehow.
So George wastes no time in recruiting his team, making sure to get several people who are very familiar with the Western country and the local natives. I mean, one thing George knows how to do is go off for months into the country at this point because he's been doing it for years.
In the wilderness.
He's been doing it for years now as part of his job as a surveyor. So they made their way through the untamed wilderness, dealt with some shitty weather, and there's this one point where this is Pennsylvania in the middle of winter. So it's cold as fuck. There's snow, icy rivers everywhere.
Fun.
And so they get to a river crossing, and there's just it's like ice flows, flowing down the river. They're all putting their stuff in canoes or rafts and going to easier crossings. And George decides, to swing his dick a little bit and show everybody how cool he is. He rides his horse directly into the water, and the horse swims across, and he's like high in the saddle, just looking every inch the total badass as the horse just cuts through this icy water.
And then the horse gets hypothermia and dies.
Not this time.
R.I.P. horse.
No, we're not to the point where horses die yet.
Not yet.
We have multiple horse deaths in this story, but we're not there. At this point, to be fair, this is just a baller move. He just looks cool. Everybody's just
look at that guy's
people tell
dick.
the stories of this guy as he rides his horse straight into the water. And through his entire life, George is an incredible horseman. This is like one of the things he's very good at. He's an accomplished rider, and he does this scene even in the Revolutionary War later on. Middle-aged George Washington rides his horse across rivers, and everybody's like, "Damn!" So it's just one of his signature moves, just to show how cool he is. He knows how to do this.
I've trained my horses, bitches.
So then it was like once they cross, this is where they get to the forks in the Ohio that his brother had prized as this spot. So they make a camp, and then George starts taking, doing his surveying thing and taking great notes for saying, okay, this is where we need to build this fort for his report. So then he dispatches messengers to the local tribal leaders because he needs information about French activity, and he wants an escort to Fort the Beef. So that's when Tenagrisson, I think that's what he's called, the half-king, comes back into the story. And even though this guy's twice George's age, they say that they got along. Like, George earns some respect from this guy. Because once again, he may be a little bit of a fancy boy, but Farah is tough and brave. So, and that's another thing too, where George and if you read his journals and letters, he's kind of a mixed bag when it comes, like, he's not as instantly racist as some of the people of his time. Like, he's
instantly racist.
He's respectful for what the natives are good at, but he essentially calls them all mercenary and money grubbing and questions their loyalty, which if you read the rest of this...
I mean, that could be fair, though. If he's questioning loyalties, they didn't have a whole lot of them.
Like, if you hear the rest of this story and look at it purely from his point of view, you can see where he's coming from. But if you look at it from their point of view, you can totally understand why they're just trying to make the best of... they got dealt this bad hand.
They're like, oh, excuse me, can you please help me with this land I'm stealing from you?
So this was still the age of genteel war and diplomacy. So George reaches this little French trading post, and they immediately invite him to dinner as their guests. The wine is flowing freely at this dinner. French are getting all completely wine drunk, and George is just sitting there listening while they just say the quiet part out loud. They're like, "Oh yes, well, the French will dominate this region and kick the British out." And he's just like, "Oh, okay, I see how this is," and is quietly taking notes. For his entire life, George is not much of a drinker, and he also thinks that people serving the military shouldn't drink at all. And once again, there's a couple points in this story. It's like, oh, okay, I get why he has this opinion. This is one of them where it's like, he's there as this diplomat, and they're literally saying his mission is doomed to fail. I mean, he's just doing the courtesy of handing them a note that they're going to ignore.
And then telling him to his face.
They told him to his face, but... Then they provide him an escort. So at this point, he's got a French escort and his native escort taking him all the way to Fort Shia LaBeouf. He delivers the message on behalf of the British Crown, and then they ask him, can you hang out for a few days while we send word back to Governor Duquesne? We got to find out, we got to give you a message to send back to your guys. So he walks around and takes the shitload of notes about where all the people with guns are.
Where all the things are.
It's like, oh, there's a guard tower here. There's this many dudes. This is.
It was very nice of them to give him a grand tour of their facilities.
Yeah, and he wasn't being dishonest. Like, everybody knew he was doing. He's walking around and taking.
What are you doing? I'm surveying.
It's like, I'm just counting the guards up there in that tower. So, the trip back home was difficult. They decided, this is the middle of winter. The horses are not doing well, so they abandoned their horses. So this is the horse death. Maybe the horses are okay. I don't think the horses are okay. I don't think they made it.
You don't know that. They're resilient creatures.
They are. They ditched the horses, and George actually dressed up like a Native American. He actually put on like buckskin walking leathers, and maybe even moccasins.
So a little cultural appropriation.
Well, he was
in disguise.
I gotta hike through central Pennsylvania, and these clothes are way better than my fancy boy officer uniform.
Probably, yeah. He winterized.
Yes, he winterized, and so they're hiking back the rest of the way. And it was quite a little adventure. So at one point, George, he'd gotten ill again and was so tired and exhausted and malnourished that he actually had one of their native guides holding his backpack. And then in the middle, they're walking through a field, and suddenly this guy just runs out in front of them, whips out his horse pistol, and just tries to shoot these guys Pulp Fiction style.
Oh my God.
And so the guy misses. The bull just whizzes behind the trees too.
Like, Holy fuck.
So George, like, immediately, like, are you shot? No. Are you shot? No. So George's friend runs over, beats the shit out of this guy, whips out his musket and is about to blow his brains out. And George's like, no, stop, don't kill him. Just because he tried to kill us doesn't mean we need to kill him.
Well, I mean, that's debatable. That's a conversation, I guess.
So the next move, they decide to tie the guy up to a tree and then release him at night. And so then they're like terrified that guy's going to go get friends and come back and finish them off. So George and his friend, because it's just the two of them at this point, are just running for it in the opposite direction, trying to lose this guy
just
in case.
Hoofing it.
Guy's guy, and they're just terrified. And this other guy's just so pissed. He's like, why didn't you let me shoot him? We're going to die because of you. So the next day they get to another river crossing. And the river is almost completely frozen over. There's just like a chunk in the middle that's just not frozen over. And so they spend all day constructing a crude ass raft to float their way across. And so while George has made a makeshift pole and he's just kind of poling through the water, suddenly an ice floe goes loose, hits his pole, and knocks him into 10 feet of like freezing ass water.
Hypothermia.
Yeah. So George scrambles back up to the raft and they make it over to this tiny little island where there's no fire. They just hover shivering on this island all night long in the middle of, this is February in Pennsylvania, I believe.
So I guess it's advantageous for America that he didn't just die there.
Yeah. And funny enough, it was his friend who ended up getting frostbite, not George. Because once again, he was a tough bastard.
Oh, goodness.
He made his way back to Williamsburg and delivered the sealed "fuck you" letter from the French to Governor Dinwiddie. And then the governor gave him one entire night to turn his 7,000 words worth of notes into one concise report. And didn't tell him that it would be published all over the world. But George, he stayed up all night, did it, and that put his name out there for the first time, and definitely not the last. So this was George's first adventure into the wilderness, which was just...
For Governor Dinwiddie.
For Governor Dinwiddie. And it was just a formality. It was just to tell the French, you have to leave. And the French saying, no.
No.
How about no?
I taunt you a second time.
So what really pissed George off was he got a measly 50 pounds for his trip, which would be the equivalent of about 30,000 in modern dollars. But you also have to remember he had to pay for all of it up front. So he basically got his expenses covered. Comes back and doesn't have really jack to show for it, other than he almost died of pneumonia.
Almost died of getting shot, pneumonia.
Yeah. However, he was given orders to raise up and train 100 militia for, what was going to be the next move. And so George decides a little political calculus. He's like, okay, I'll do this, but and George has this thing where he always combines humility with a bit of ego. And so he's like, yes, and I humbly ask that I should be promoted to lieutenant colonel. And it was granted. Lieutenant Colonel George Washington, 22 years old. So at this point in Washington's life, you have to kind of understand that it's on one hand, he had some land, he had some things going on, but they were all kind of self-sustaining and weren't giving him a lot of money to work with. So he actually needed a job. It wasn't like he was independently wealthy. He didn't have fuck you money. He still had to work. And this paycheck versus pride thing was kind of a recurring theme with him. So, officers in the colonial militia got paid a lot less than those royal appointed ones we were talking about.
I was about to say that paycheck versus pride thing, that sounds very Hamilton.
Yeah. And so more than once, George actually turned down a paycheck and he volunteered his services rather than be paid less than what he believed he was worth. And that was really, once again, kind of a political calculus. Because if he just took this short-term job in the colonial militia, people could always say he was doing it for money or because of his connections to the Ohio Company. But by volunteering and not accepting the salary, he was able to say, well, I was just wanting to serve my country. I was just doing my part. But the thing was,
he earned political clout instead of actual capital.
But he couldn't afford it. There was a points where he had to borrow money from other people.
And that also sounds about right. Yeah. That's a very white male thing to do.
He wants to be proud. He wants everybody to think he's this.
Yeah, everyone wants him to think that he has a bigger dick than he does.
Yep.
That sounds about right.
And Washington has some serious. He's both ambitious and he has some pride.
He has some dick swinging to do yet.
And it may be that he borrowed money from his one of his best friend's father's while he was flirting heavily with that guy's wife. So
I'm going to have to learn how to not audibly sigh so much if I'm ever going to make this work.
So, but getting back to the military career, as you can imagine, George's 100 militia volunteers weren't exactly the cream of the crop.
Oh, you don't say.
So these are all guys who decided...
His inbred farmers.
Yeah. They didn't have proper clothing, weapons, or gear. They were drunk half the time. And he was...
That sounds very America, though.
He was constantly pissed off, too, that under the English system, he was forced to obey the orders of a low-ranking officer if said officer had a Royal British Commission. So that means even as a lieutenant colonel, he'd have to obey a captain, even though he technically outranked him.
Because British.
So this is one of those
British
things,
outranked Americans just by being British.
This just stung at George's pride. He fucking hated it.
I'm fucking sure he did.
Inside, he was wanting to take his massive hands and just crush the skulls of these assholes, but he couldn't. So he just tried to make the best of things and make his ragtag troops ready for their second mission into the wilderness. Meanwhile, Governor Dinwiddie sent a guy named William Trent with 40 men out to the forks of the Ohio in early 1754. That spot that George had surveyed out to begin construction of a small fort. The French, however, sent over 500 soldiers with additional support to secure the area. But once again, we're still in gentlemanly times. So the French officer not only allowed the British workers to leave peacefully, but he actually purchased their tools and construction equipment for a fair market price. So he gave them cash and then sent them on their way.
That is very polite.
I know, right?
Well, we were already here.
However, while they were leaving, essentially flipping the two middle fingers because they tore down everything the British made and built a much more grand, larger series of structures that they named after their recently promoted Governor General of New France, Fort Duquesne.
Sounds douchey.
Yeah. There's douches aplenty in this story. Our cup overfloweth with douche.
I was about to say, I don't think it's all douche. It is nothing but a big squeegee of vinegar water.
Yeah. So, Dinwiddie sent Washington and his men into the wilderness to secure and assist with the construction of what was supposed to be Fort Trent. But on the way, the guys are coming back the other direction with none of their equipment, and they're like, about that fort. So he's like learning this on the way. He's only got 100 guys with him. So then his tribal allies show up, including, once again, the Half King, who looks at these 100 assholes and is immediately not thrilled with the situation.
Yeah, well, I'm not thrilled with this situation, and I'm not there. Because
he had just been out there in the Ohio country, and he knows how many French soldiers are there. And he's like, and you show up with these guys. But George is like, he assures everyone. He's like, no. This is the tip of the spear. We're just the vanguard of this huge British host with cannons and all kinds of guys.
So he bullshitted them?
Yes. He was 100% talking out of his ass at this time.
I mean, sometimes a bunch of bullshit. If you can get away with it.
It's like he's not going to get barely into this trip and immediately turn around and run back to Governor Dinwiddie and say, there's
too many of these guys, man.
He's not going to do that. He's trying to prove himself. And he's
got dicks to swing.
He's 22 years old, and I can tell you, as a guy who was once a 22-year-old male, you are convinced you're invincible and you can just pull off any impossible task that you set for yourself. So after clearing out an area and establishing a temporary base, they got word of a small French scouting force not far away. And then that night they're camped, and everybody is hearing people skulking around. They're convinced that there are French spies creeping around their camp. They don't catch anybody, but they're like, their nerves are shot, and they're convinced they're all about to be murdered in their sleep.
They're all paranoid.
Yeah, they're all freaked out. The scouts find a small group of French Canadians encamped nearby in kind of a hidden glen. So George decides they're going to go after these guys because they said they're convinced that they were the ones fucking around in their camp.
They're the French spies.
Right. The Half King scouted the enemy's location, found out where these guys were encamped, and so they decide to march through the night to prep their first engagement with the enemy. Now, I've seen photographs and watched a video of a guy walking around the location that this happened in. George's story is that they sort of completely surrounded the glen, but were spotted by the French, who immediately opened fire on them, so the battle immediately ensued. Mm-hmm. And that may be true. I have no way of knowing what happened for sure. But if you look at the terrain It was an ambush.
It sounds like a bunch of bullshit.
It was an ambush because it's like there's like a high ridge with a bunch of tree cover, and that's where George and his guys were positioned, and he sent all the natives on the backside to cut off any possibility of retreat. So all the French are literally like asleep in their bedrolls. And then if you look at the numbers, 10 French soldiers were shot dead and more were wounded. Almost nobody gets hurt on the British side. And so the whole thing was over in like 15 minutes. So what happened next is also debated to this very day. The French commanding officer was named Joseph Coulon de Jumonville, and he was bearing diplomatic papers on his person. That means if the French forces had simply been on a diplomatic mission, and if George had fired on them unprovoked, then he'd have committed a no-no in this age of gentlemanly warfare that we've been talking about.
So, obviously, there's no way he would have done that.
So there are 3 versions of this story. We'll see what you think might have happened after you hear all of them.
This is a very Clue moment.
So one version of this story, and maybe the most dramatic, is that this guy Jumonville was wounded during the skirmish, but then he started waving his papers around in the air. It's like, I am a diplomat, do not shoot. And then started reading his own message from the French government, declaring that all British were ordered to leave the Ohio River Valley. So the half-king walks right up to the officer and splits his face open with a tomahawk in front of God and everybody.
Oh, that tracks.
That guy really hated the French. Remember the whole
I mean,
ate my father thing. You ate my father, prepare to die. And if that wasn't enough, he dipped his hands in the officer's brains and then scalped him. Now, the second version of the story says that Jumonville was just simply shot and killed in the middle of the battle, and that's just all there was to it. Either way, he's dead. And then what happens next isn't up for debate. The Native Americans descended on the wounded French soldiers, braining, just smashing in the skulls of all of them and scalping all of them. So like the ones who just simply surrendered were allowed to live, but all of the wounded were just massacred right then and there. The natives just finish off and scalp the wounded French. So George Washington was the commanding officer during an ambush that included atrocities that were a bit foreign to the European sensibilities. Though to be fair, if he was too hard on his native allies, they would abandon the British and he'd be up shit creek without even a paddle or a canoe. So while the George claimed the French fired first and reasoned that they were on a diplomatic mission, he was like, well, if these guys wouldn't have picked such a hidden spot for their camp, if they were truly diplomats, they'd just walked right up and handed us a note. And they were sneaking around our camp the night before, which means they're spies and it was totally cool. We did everything right, you guys.
It's totally kosher. It's fine.
And, so George always maintained this to the day he died, that this was a legit fight and that the other guys fired first. Which is a smart thing to say because most historians consider the Battle of Jumonville Glen the first shots fired in the French and Indian War. And which also means that depending on how you look at that, this may be one of the opening skirmishes of an entire world war that spanned 5 entire continents.
Thanks, George.
Now, the French version, the third version of the story...
We basically know that the revolution was just 2 guys named George swinging their dicks around.
Indeed. But at this point, the Georges are all lined up against the French.
Their dicks are swinging in the same direction.
So, the third French version of the story paints the British as dishonorable ambushers who shot Jumonville in the head while he was reading his papers. And they actually said that the Native Americans prevented a total massacre. They even said that the natives actually rushed forward and put their bodies in harm's way to prevent all of the prisoners from being executed. And once again, if you remember how the French are trying to make their allies happy, painting natives as heroes, once again, makes sense. So everybody has reasons to lie about all this, so there's no way to know the truth.
The truth is everyone was wrong and everyone was terrible.
Yeah.
And they probably just... It could have literally been anything.
But as far as the French go, George Washington is a war criminal, and that may be fair. So he sends the message back to Governor Dinwiddie, who's stuck with, okay, what do we do now? But remember, there was direct orders from the crown. If the French don't leave, you're supposed to shoot at them. So Dinwiddie's like, okay. So he sends strings of wampum, which I don't know if you remember what wampum, but that was sort of like the beads made of seashells and oysters and stuff like that was used as currency and trade between tribes. It was sort of like the native de facto trading thing. So sends wampum and barrels of rum for, quote, Indian diplomacy, while writing letters back to London and making it sound like the British troops were just minor partners. We had to help them out. We were allies after all.
We were there to shoot them.
Yeah.
You know.
And the
in
French
fairness.
got shot. So either way, the consequences of these actions spiraled far beyond the colonies and contributed to the whole global 7 years World War thing.
Or 22.
As Ron Chernow puts it, while the folks at home embraced him as an improbable hero, Washington was denigrated in England as a reckless young warrior, and in France as an outright assassin. So again, way to go, George.
I can't think of George Washington as an assassin, though. I mean,
knowing how he presented himself, and I've been reading a lot about young George Washington, I don't think
ambusher. Yes.
I don't think he knowingly shot the guy waving around diplomatic papers. Either it's true that one of the natives killed the guy, because if he was wounded, they did kill all the wounded people, or he just got shot in the battle and he just died as a result of that. But I don't think he intentionally pulled that move, because for once again, that wouldn't have gone with the reputation he was going for. But he was stuck.
But it happened.
But he was stuck with what happened. Now, accounts of George's command style over the years always point to his homicidal bravery. I mean, he was always willing to put himself in incredible danger, and over the course of his life had multiple horses shot out from under him, or would go back and find just bullet holes in his coat. And he just acted like he was invincible, and frankly, there's no evidence to say that he wasn't bulletproof, because he never got shot his entire life, despite putting himself in many situations where he was getting shot at. And he always led from the front, like he was not a...
He deflected them, just...
Now, around this time, in his early 20s, he wrote to his brother Jack, quote, "I have heard the bullets whistle, and believe me, there was something charming in the sound." Which, again, he was writing to his brother, trying to sound tough and cool. Like he was the Patrick Swayze of the day. Very, very, very macho.
Oh, wow.
And funny enough, the word of that got out, and at one point King George was like perhaps he'd change his mind if he hears a few more.
Yeah, I mean...
So George pulls his men back several miles to a defensive position and begin construction on a little emergency fort so they could dig in and not... Because George does not want to run away all the way back to Virginia. He wants to hold the ground that they've gained.
Well, of course, because he's, still swinging his giant...
He's invincible.
Bullet-deflecting dick.
But he knows that he's not in a great position. So he's smart enough. You can get an idea of his mindset by the name he gives this little fort. Fort Necessity.
Fort Necessity. I mean, which is the mother of all invention.
When the tribal allies took stock of the situation, they realized the British were incredibly outnumbered, and they decided to peace out, making the British even more vulnerable. Well, actually, Virginians. The half-king described Fort Necessity as that little thing upon the meadow.
Oh, what? That can't possibly. I mean, that's not good for George's giant dick.
No. So they got deserted. The natives were like, oh, fuck this. We have zero reason. Out. No reason to die here for you guys. No, thank you. So one thing I'm completely skipping over is all the road building that's been going on this whole time and throughout the war. So you can pretty much assume that whenever we're not talking about building a fort or a battle, there are people working on roads full time because you need them in order to get supply wagons in, to get troops in faster.
Roads are important.
Roads are a big deal. Everybody, they learned that lesson well from the Roman Empire, that good roads mean you can get things and people around fast. So they're doing all that. So while they're working on this fort and getting everything ready, they're also building roads so that the people and cannons, and they do get a little bit of reinforcements from Virginia. So they're up to 300 men in Fort Necessity. And so on June 28th, George calls everyone back into the fort from road building and such to brace for an upcoming French attack. He realized a couple things quite quickly. His men were exhausted, malnourished, and he didn't have nearly enough fighting men to defend the flimsy fort. You can almost say they were outgunned, outmanned, outnumbered, outplanned.
Yeah. And, well, that's a prequel for his entire career.
Yeah.
As a military commander. I mean, you just described the entire, American army.
He was used to being behind the 8-ball. But like the Spartan warriors of the Bronze Age, George was convinced his 300 men could hold out against a much larger force, despite the fact that shabby Fort Necessity was very badly placed. It was too small, and it was in a meadow, surrounded by woods and higher ground.
Oh, ew.
Yeah, so George defends this the rest of his life, like, I was not an idiot when I picked this spot for this fort. But the truth is, it was like the perfect place.
The worst spot to have a fort.
Right. You give the French
Yeah.
sharpshooters an elevated position where they can use trees as cover.
I don't know jack about shit, but I know you want the high ground.
And giving
again,
the enemy
I know
obvious...
jack about shit when it comes to like any kind of hunting, military, even just wilderness.
Granting the enemy a raised position to fire on you from cover isn't the best planning,
My
George.
10-year-old with a Nerf gun can strategize better.
So, but George, once again, his pride forces him to defend this decision for the rest of his life.
He's lucky that he didn't have to defend that fort for the rest of his life.
Well, his life would have been short if he fought to the death. So, on the way, the French forces found the site of Jumonville Glen and the bodies just laying out there, and were decidedly pissed off. It probably didn't help that the commander of the French forces was Jumonville's older brother, looking for some very personal payback.
Yeah, that tracks.
So I keep bringing up Hamilton, but if you remember in the musical, there's a line Washington does, and I'll try to sing that line a cappella. He goes, "I was younger than you are now. When I was given my first command, I led my men straight into a massacre. I witnessed their deaths firsthand." This is what he was talking about. This moment right here at Fort Necessity. The colonial troops were already surrounded by constant gunfire when God decided to make things worse, and a heavy rain began. And this is back in the days when keeping your powder dry was like an actual thing you had to worry about. So suddenly their muskets are completely useless.
This went from bad to worse.
Yep.
To ultimately just stupid.
And because the fort was so small, and they had 300 guys, they had to dig trenches all the way around and just position some guys just in the trenches. So these guys were literally just getting shot at, and they're filling up with mud and blood. And then meanwhile, because they couldn't fit any of the animals that they had with them as part of their, a roving supplies, they just were all left out in this open meadow. So the French and natives just butchered all the horses, cattle, and dogs to deprive the colonials everything.
Of everything, because...
So they're inside, they have like a little bit of flour and bacon left. 100 of the Virginians have already been killed by gunfire. But if you want to know how bad it is one-sided, the French suffered only 3 dead and 17 wounded. So 20 total casualties, even though there were way more of them.
Good job, George. Good job.
So that night, the French decided, they signaled they would be willing to, negotiate surrender. Like they knew that the British were fucked. Inside Fort Necessity, the Virginia militiamen had about enough of this, so they busted out the rum that was meant for Indian diplomacy and got shit-faced drunk. And
as one does.
Because they were all...
Yeah, you're either looking at death or imprisonment.
A third of them were already dead.
You're looking at starvation, death.
They had...
Yeah, there was nowhere for them to go but drunk.
They were out of food. They couldn't even shoot their fucking guns. They couldn't shoot
They couldn't even shoot themselves. So we're getting fucked, y'all.
Yep. So
they had an epic death party.
So George realizes
that
his men basically they were just getting trashed. And so he had to wave the proverbial white flag.
Which could have actually been a physical white flag.
Oh yeah, they did that back then.
Yeah.
But
it might not have even been
But in this
proverbial.
point, it still had to come. Like, the sad part was, like, it still came from the French side first. It's like, hey, do you guys want to surrender? Because we don't really want to kill all of you. An interpreter went back and forth between the two sides.
George.
Yeah. The interpreter went back and forth between the two sides, and the guy finally coming back with the terms written, all the terms of surrender written in French, the ink running from the rain. So when George signed the surrender agreement, he didn't realize it included a confession for the assassination of Jumonville.
So he accidentally confessed.
He accidentally he was accidentally confessed to the political assassination of a French diplomat.
In any other story, this would be the sad end of George for being a political assassin.
So this naturally provided plenty of justification for further French support of the war, was a total black eye on the diplomatic reputation of England, who had treated George himself so honorably, and like already the newspapers all over the world had learned about what George had done. So if that wasn't bad enough, they seized George's diary and passed it back to Governor General Duquesne.
Oh, that's terrible.
Who made fun of Washington and then published the entire thing in Paris.
That's such a dick move. I mean, it's kind of glorious. Look at this asshole.
Yeah.
So
this is a low point in George's career.
A low point I was about to say, I've never heard this.
So this is like so poor George was defeated. Having been humiliated, George and his men are allowed to march back. They're not taken as prisoners. They're just ordered to leave. And Fort Necessity's torn down. George is defeated. His reputation has been curb stomped. And then his brother's, Lawrence's last surviving child, dies. And George inherits Mount Vernon. He resigns his commission in the Virginia militia and decides to set about preparing his first planting of tobacco. And that's where we're going to end part 1 on young George Washington and the French and Indian War.
Part 1.
Next time when we get together, I'm going to tell you about George's third and final expedition, and where he has to take a subservient role this time, because now some things are going to get shaking. The war is going to heat up. The British are going to decide they're going to fund a much more aggressive campaign. And they're going to send in regular British troops. The guy George wants to be part of, that he wishes he was an officer of. And unfortunately, George is forced to serve under a very traditional, stuffy British general named Braddock.
Well, I mean, after being publicly humiliated to the entire world with the reading of one's diary.
So this is George's chance.
This is now salty George.
If he has to suck up his pride, but if he wants to salvage his military reputation, he's got to go do this one more time. And Braddock is one of these guys who thinks that you should, like, you fight like you do in the old country. You march your dudes in red coats and you put them in a field and you line them up all next to each other and you signal that it's time to start shooting each other.
Yeah, that's dumb.
Yeah, the French don't fight that way in the American colonies, so that's going to go badly, and George is going to have to be there to pick up the pieces when it does.
Oh, George.
Oh, George. Yeah, so then we'll get on to and we'll talk about how all of the fallout from all of this directly contributes to a bunch of pissed off Americans who decide to shake off
bunch of
these
colonists.
Kings. Yeah.
And their fucking taxes and their bullshit.
Yeah, and even though we'll get into this too, this is also interestingly a period where when this war heats up is the first time that there is a meeting between representatives from all 13 colonies. So it establishes this precedent. So the idea is, do we join together as colonies to support the war effort to fight the French? Because the colonies they were just all independent of each other. They didn't, other than some trade, had nothing to do with each other up to this point. So they came up with the chief architect of what they called the Albany Plan, because it was done in Albany, New York, was none other than Benjamin Franklin. And he published a very famous political cartoon of a snake in 13 segments, and underneath it says "Join or Die," which, even though it didn't work, the Albany Plan was approved by the little convention they called, but the state, well, not states yet, but the colonies didn't approve it back home. So it got rejected, but it laid the groundwork, and that slogan, and even the image of a snake representing the colonies, which will be used later in the Revolution with the "Don't Tread on Me," which is now used by douchebags. Okay, so signing off, I will just simply say, if you want to follow me in any of the crap that I do on the internet, I have a website called jamiechambers.net that will take you to the other stuff. If you want to financially support the stuff that we're doing with this, you can check out my Patreon at patreon.com/jamiechambers. And that's it for me. Bambi probably wants to avoid all contact.
Yeah, please don't look me up.
Don't find her. Don't look for her.
Me up.
If you see her in public, don't acknowledge her.
Yeah. Maybe wave. It depends on what kind of day I'm having.
You can side-eye her.
Yeah, you will never find me on Twitter. Ever. You possibly can find me on Facebook, but good luck with that. I post never.
Yeah.
I have zero online presence, and I intend to keep it that way somewhat.
Well, except for now.
Well, again, this is very limited. This is more like your online presence, not mine.
You get to listen. You get to listen to Bambi share her opinions, and you can completely leave her alone.
Yeah, exactly.
So bother
You know what?
me
You
online.
don't have to even like my opinions. I give no fucks at all.
So
I'm not even saying I'm right.
So forward your sexist and harassing emails to me.
Your misogynist bullshit directly to Jamie because
I will deal with it on her behalf.
have no interest.
So next time we will talk about George Washington and the end of all this bullshit.
And some more douchebaggery.